Hello and welcome to Shape the System, where we find and tell the stories that help people to rethink the way the world works. We interview people from all over the world who are helping to change our systems for the better. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures, who help ambitious founders and their teams scale up for success. More about KPMG High Growth Ventures after the interview. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hi everyone, it's Vincent, your host. Welcome back to Shape the System. Today we're having a chat with Lily Dempster. Hey Lily, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's go straight in. As I just said before, we would love to hear about this problem that you're working on. Let's dive straight into the detail.
Yeah, sure. So I run an organization, a business called One Small Step. And the problem we're addressing is really the problem of behaviour change with respect to climate change. There's a lot of stuff that needs to happen to keep us below 2 degrees of global warming. And that's kind of, we want to be getting to 1.5 or 2 degrees of global warming at a max. If we can go lower than that, that's better. There's a lot of things we need to be doing to help mitigate global warming. One of the things we need to be doing is making fairly wide-scale changes to our behaviours, so our lifestyles, that have an impact on the amount of energy we use, the sources of energy we use, the stuff we buy, how big the carbon footprint is of all of the stuff we buy, the amount of fuel we use, the amount of waste we generate. And we actually have quite a lot of control as individuals on, who we buy from, at least some of the time, which businesses we give our custom to. And also there are a series of kind of finite changes we can make that reduce what's called our per capita footprint, carbon footprint, so per person carbon footprint. And I recognize there was sort of this gap in the environmental movement where we're doing a lot on the political front, to try to get policy changes in a couple of different areas, but that there was this sort of space around what individuals and households are doing if we make those changes en masse. And there are I think there are cost and time effective ways to support people to make those changes. We can have a pretty rapid impact on carbon emissions, and we can also increase the market share of eco-friendly businesses in the process. So that's kind of what I'm working on.
Got it. And so just there's a bunch in here that I want to dive into. You talked about behaviour change. A lot of the time when you present someone with a thing that, that they might need to do, and this could be related to their health, or it could be related to their sleep patterns or anything like that, there's an awareness that starts, and then there's the ability for that person to take action. So just coming back up a step before the behaviour change itself, do you feel that we've arrived at a place where people are aware that there's an issue en masse and at least buy into that broadly? And obviously not everyone, but a good chunk of people, the majority.
I'd say there's a good chunk. So
yep.
from the work that, like the research we've done, there's, what you call market sizing. So how many people, say in Australia, care about climate change and sustainability, and they really want to do something in their own lives to help address the problem. There's you kind of fall along a trajectory. Some people are really passionate about it. Some people are really worried. Some people are, but it's one amongst many concerns, which is pretty typical and understandable.
Sure.
So that, depending on how you frame that kind of segment of people, it's between 5 and 14 million. It's just the level of motivation and the level of concern kind of differs. But, there's at least, and my background's environmental advocacy. So part of the reason why I started doing this was I realized that there are literally millions of Australians who really care about this and want to make significant changes. But there's a lot of information out there that makes it pretty hard to know, well, actually what's effective for me and how does this integrate into my lifestyle. And sustainability is essentially a skill set that you have to build. And a lot of the information out there it's just information, and information alone isn't sufficient to support people to change their behaviour.
Got it. And so in that context then, I'm going to say the app, but I know that it's more than that, and we'll come to that a bit later on. But what the application is enabling people to do is to say, we already know that you're attuned to this issue. There's the gaps here are you're not sure what to do, what steps to take, or what steps are the steps you should take first in terms of the easiest things or the biggest wins, but also a framework around that creates both the pathway but also in some respects the motivation.
Yeah, I think that from the user research we've done a fair amount, the kind of through line is people feel guilty, they feel worried about climate change as an issue, but they also feel cognitively overloaded. You know, we're all pretty stressed. We all have a lot on. We all are trying to get a lot done in any given week. And so, you know, having the wherewithal to actually, you know, treat, oh, well, how am I going to green my home? It's sort of like, well, that's on the end of the life admin list, along with sort of where's my next paycheck coming from? You know, there's plenty of things people are concerned about in their lives, and the environment is one of them. But it's really about making it clear for people that there are a couple of things that they can do. And our app, you know, we've designed it with behavioral science, you know, with a behavioral science kind of framework. We're sort of trying to make it easy, show that this is where you're starting from in terms of your carbon footprint. This is where you need to get to. Here are some programs we recommend that we've tailored to suit you based on your sort of household type, for example, that will help you reduce your footprint. And here's a sort of program structure that makes those steps really easy to follow. So we're sort of taking the guesswork out, providing some positive reinforcement and sort of communications and design systems that in other areas have been proven to help people to adopt new habits.
Yeah, perfect. And look, I think I've got a reasonable understanding of behavioural economics and behavioural science. I just think it would be useful perhaps to explain some of those levers, like there's a bunch of them, but the ones that probably are really specifically and specifically used here.
Yeah, sure. So I guess when you think about, there's a whole bunch of different academic disciplines, areas of scientific inquiry looking at human behaviour, right? Like psychology, marketing, like there's a bunch of groups that have been looking at this stuff for forever. Behavioural economics, you know, it really is looking at applying psychology to economic problems and looking at the idea of humans not really necessarily being rational actors. You know, there's a whole series of things that affect human behavior that are not about maximizing, you know, value or self-interest necessarily.
Sure.
So, you know, the work of Dan Kahneman, for example, it outlines that there are these ways that we make decisions as human beings that are formed kind of quickly in our mind through what are called heuristics. So our environment actually, and the cues we receive from our environment actually shape our decisions and our behavior a lot more than we realize.
Right.
And part of what we're doing in the app, quite transparently, is trying to support people. So we're removing decision-making friction. Mm-hmm. We're offering kind of prompts and suggestions that help people move along the behavioural sort of trajectory to get to the point where they're going to take action using systems that have been shown to be effective with the uptake of pro-environmental behaviour. So using things like implementation intentions, helping people schedule things into their calendar, making the step really tiny. That's a BJ Fogg kind of approach. So what's the sort of starter step? What are the things you need to sort of, so for example, in our cycling program, rather than just saying, oh, you should cycle to work more often, we have a whole series of steps, one of which is like just prompting people to put their cycling clothes out, you know, on their chair in front of their bed so that in the morning they put on their cycling clothes and their work clothes are already packed. So it's sort of little steps like that help you structure your environment so it's easier for you to take that action and you're not having to do it all, you know, with the system 2 part of your brain where you're really having to kind of make a lot of decisions. We're trying to help you reduce the decision-making load. There's other things like social normative messaging is one prompt where we kind of reference, well, there's people doing this activity. Do you want to join them? That's just, you know, a very...
Social proof.
So like, you know, there's a whole series of different things we've tested it and we'll continue to test. And the product, you know, we launched it in May. So I'm quite excited because I think the best thing that we have in it is, you know, it's nice to use, it's friendly, it feels like you're doing something that's achievable. But the main thing is that we have a strong analytics system where we can actually, you know, test a lot of different approaches with that behavioral economics, cognitive science kind of background in the features that we build and then work out what's most effective and scale those features pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's a fascinating model. I think, look, I spent a bit of time building personal finance software and was lucky enough to do a behavioral economics course with Dan Ariely over in San Francisco.
Yeah, I love him. He's great.
And like just fascinating stuff, you know, like really powerful stuff. I think the great example I remember was the one where they redesigned the cafeteria. So this is a US example, but the cafeteria line, knowing that kids get there hungry and the first thing they do is load up their plate. So they just switched everything to put all the salads right at the front. By the time the kids got to the fish, you know, the fish and chips at the end or whatever they serve in America, you know, they didn't have any room on their plate anymore and they, you know, they were satiated as a result and that changed the behavioural approach and obviously the health outcomes. So the behavioural science bit I think is fascinating. I think you're going to get a fascinating set of data. There's sort of two other strands to this, and I'd love to dive into these separately. And one of these, which is sort of related, is this idea of like purpose/community. And I think you've actually been at this problem for a little while ahead of the launch that was in May, just a couple of months ago. What role does community play in all of this?
Yeah, so it's huge. I don't think that it's an interesting framework, right? In the environmental movement, you have this tendency to kind of go, okay, we either need top-down reform or we need grassroots reform or grassroots campaigning, and one influences the other. But there's a tendency for people to kind of try to think, we don't want to just be looking at the individual. We need to be looking at the whole of society. Or we don't want to just be looking at the individual. We need to be looking at the major stakeholders, with direct emissions responsibility, like some of the biggest companies, most of which are energy companies providing individuals with their energy supply. Right. But I kind of think community is essentially just groups of people and neighborhoods and localities that, care about each other and are working towards something together. And so, one of the things we're doing at the moment is trying to actively build a digital community through the kind of sustainability at home program we're offering for free. Right. So we're doing that, with a kind of Facebook community group. We're encouraging people to sort of share the results of this kind of 6-week sort of set of challenges they're doing, mostly stuff around the home you can do in the kind of coronavirus context, because we know how important it is that people get support from one another and you're kind of modeling the behavior that you want other people to take up, and it has this sort of virtuous cycle. So that's one component of how important it is to see the group moving, the group behaving in a different way. It's not just an individual working in isolation, but there's also this kind of aspect to it around the proof that if we have a couple of thousand people, making weekly changes to their meat intake, or, cycling a few more times to work, actually having a carbon model that estimates the carbon impact of those changes and tallies it, and being able to see that in real time. That's one of the features of the app that I'm very proud of.
Yeah.
Obviously, we need to keep working on how rigorous that model is, and there are limits to it because we're sort of estimating for different people what their emissions impact would be. But that's another aspect of it that's really exciting, is that we can kind of support people to act at the individual level, but then you can see how your behavior actually has a flow-on effect in that it influences the people around you, and here is the collective impact of the group.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think before there was initially only Google Maps, for example, and then Waze came out with, this idea of beating traffic together was kind of their moniker, and it changed the positioning of that navigational app to actually we're all here to try and beat traffic, make sure you report stuff that causes traffic problems. And I think that reframing from solve your own problem to let's be part of a larger solution is a really interesting, which seems to be at play here.
Yeah, and also that, if you're attempting to change your behavior without anyone else doing it with you, it's a lot harder. Having a community approaching this collectively, it's self-reinforcing.
Yeah.
So, in the same way that you have communities of people advocating for policy change, you can have communities of people working on upskilling and sustainability and making changes together, reporting on how they're going, sharing their results, celebrating the impact that they have. That's kind of what we're trying to cultivate as part of the product.
And is a part of that to do with, and this is quite a specific example, but I'm thinking about other areas where people want the outcome, right? They want their health to be good, but it requires effort and it requires behaviour change. And there's an element of challenge that says that you're going to make a statement in the public domain and you will hold yourself to account because you've externalized that. Are you even looking at those kinds of approaches within that community function?
I mean, where they're evidence-based, I mean, it's quite, like with leaderboards, for example, like a lot of people go, oh, you should make it a competition, let everyone compete. And there's a lot of research on what's effective and what's not with leaderboards. And I guess if you look at games, like a whole bunch of different video games, leaderboards is sort of an example of like, I'm going to be like, what am I doing? I'm sharing my results. I'm being externally accountable. But a lot of leaderboards, if you're near the bottom, that's super demotivating. If you're near the top and you're a certain type of person, then that can be really motivating. But for the majority of people, I think that what the value we're providing them through this free app is actually getting a sense of self-efficacy about their environmental footprint and kind of going, oh, it's actually, I can make some changes and I can actually achieve something meaningful. And it makes me feel better. And there are all these other benefits, like to my health, in terms of my financial savings. It's not just the environmental impact, and I feel really good about it. So that's kind of our focus. And yeah, in terms of whether we encourage people to kind of share what they're doing, you know, we do sort of say, if you want to share the app or you want to share your results, you know, go ahead. But it's a lot more about doing programs together and than it is about
being part of something larger.
Than it is about saying, look what I did.
No, it's super interesting kind of nuance, because I think we tend to think in terms of a lot of behavioural change, and there's a lot of schools of thought that actually just directly follow the gaming industry and like give people badges and give them all these things. And I think in hyper, you know, I guess competitive environments, I'm thinking like Strava and these kind of things, that probably does work because that's actually what they're there to do, but that's not necessarily the motivation. I actually did a chat with a solar, I think a nationwide solar like installer about a year ago, and they were indicating to me that one of the biggest motivations they found with customers wanting to switch to solar was to actually not have the guilt of turning on their air conditioner, as a parable for just a more broad sense of, I want to be able to have a comfortable life, but I don't want to feel that I'm doing the wrong thing here.
Yeah.
Do you see this kind of playing out with what customers are doing, or what the users of the platform are doing?
I mean, it reduces cognitive dissonance. You know, we think of ourselves as caring people, and we care about the planet and we care about climate change. But, you know, we're in systems where everybody's contributing to the problem a little bit, you know, and that really doesn't sit well with some people. And then there's kind of, you know, I've gone through it. I, in some ways, created this product for myself because I worked in the environmental movement, and then I looked at my own behavior and I went, well, my behavior is not really consistent with my values. You know, why is that? And what can I do to change it? And it's a sort of, it's partly about reducing that cognitive dissonance so that I can kind of feel you know what, I'm doing what I can, and I'm going through this process, and I'm kind of making incremental changes. And when I do those changes and they fit with my lifestyle and they actually benefit me rather than take away from my life, like not running the heater and freezing in winter, you know, that's not a nice way to be kind to the environment because you're not caring for yourself in the process. You know,
Absolutely put on a jumper. And then there's a second aspect of this that I wanted to – I'm currently rugged up in a jumper. It's kind of cold today in Sydney. There's a second aspect of this which I think you touched on right at the start, which I think is critical here, which is about where you put your custom. You made the point that the energy companies at an aggregate level are responsible for a huge amount of our emissions, but we choose the energy companies in a lot of respects, especially at the retail level. What role are you playing in, you know, the great equalizer in that market and actually providing access to those companies and to a degree vetting those companies?
So we're a small team. It's myself and one other full-time staff and 2 part-time staff. So where we've included product recommendations, service recommendations in the current version of the app, we vetted really carefully, and it's mostly because of my background, having worked in those industries or consulting to them. You know, where we've got product recommendations at the moment is in electricity retail, so recommending people switch their energy provider because it is a very effective thing you can do as a consumer. You know, we have a couple that we recommend in the app. Amber, PowerShop are 2 of the sort of front runners in terms of their environmental credentials. So, you know, part of that is looking at third-party sort of certifications like the Greenpeace Green Electricity Guide. Amber's a newcomer, but they get, you know, they offset everybody's carbon emissions, as do PowerShop. Both companies do really good work in terms of supporting renewable energy. And
we've had Amber on the show actually.
And you know, similarly, we have recommendations on banking and superannuation just based on the environmental credentials of the super funds and banks. So that's kind of where we felt confident. With solar, we're planning on releasing, you know, a solar program, but we're making sure that we're working in partnership with an expert sort of reviewer, and we're being pretty careful about who we recommend. And you know, because solar is so complex technically, it's really important that we get it right if we're going to include recommendations on specific retailers, solar retailers or installers.
And I guess sort of that's my question, is like a lot of, like I had obviously had to play with it before coming in for the show, and I found that it looked like a lot of the early levers are simply changes to behaviour. You don't have to, you know, switching banks is obviously a lever, or you know, changing a particular provider, but simply moving from, you know, 7 days a week of meat to 2 days a week of meat. I guess where I'm getting to, what are the big levers typically for people in their day to day?
So dietary change is a big one. It's one of the most significant. If you have control over your source of energy, so, if you have a home and you can install solar and battery, obviously that's huge. Similarly with like your mode of transportation. So diet, energy, transport, they're the big ones.
Yeah, the three big ones.
And then more incrementally, I mean, one of the areas of the carbon model we have that we're really, trying to work hard on is purchases. Because if you look at consumption-based carbon accounting, what you buy, it really has a significant footprint attached to it. But, to be able to determine whether one product is better than another, you have to go through a whole life cycle analysis, and it can be pretty dicey. So, that's an area where we'll be kind of working on that, and again, looking for really good partners to support us if we're going to be making product recommendations on specific product switches.
Yeah. And look, and like I know that the big sort of elephant in the room under the environmental umbrella is climate specifically, and CO2 is a measure of that. But there's other things that are not specifically relating to reducing your carbon footprint that are having an impact on the environment. Is part of the day-to-day behaviour that someone might exhibit having other impacts or able to have other impacts on other environmental things that are potentially related to those?
Yeah. I mean, plastic waste is a good example of that, where it's not actually one of the worst things from just purely looking at greenhouse gas emissions. It does release some hydrocarbons over time, but it has a whole series of other problems that it creates. And most people who care about the environment also are very aware of the problem of plastic waste. So that's one of the things we include at the moment, like our kind of key thing that we measure for users is their carbon footprint.
Sure.
But I think over time we may branch out a little bit. And we do have some suggestions on plastic waste. It's just that the impacts that we've calculated there are just the carbon footprint impact, and not, I think that what the reduction in plastic waste is and what the impacts of that are, what the flow-on impacts. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like, if you can crack the nut on personal behaviour change as part of a larger kind of purpose-based outcome, then the world's your oyster in a lot of respects, because you can start with the environment, climate specifically, and then broadly the environment, and then even other issues around diversity or in the society more broadly, education.
I mean, it's a really ambitious project, and the thing that I'm excited about to be at this point now is it's an experiment. We have a series of assumptions about what will support a group of people to change their behavior, and we can now test them in this user interface we've built and figure out what is effective. And we've got a head start in that there's where the features and systems we have built are based off of academic research and scientific experiments on what's been effective, in a controlled environment. And it's been interesting also having to kind of integrate not just, here's a randomized control trial that showed, we showed people how they compare to others on their energy bills. So if they were, consuming more than the average, we saw an immediate drop in their energy consumption. You see those kinds of studies cropping up all the time, but actually integrating some of the research and case studies from other behaviour change apps that aren't focusing on pro-environmental behaviour change, and what is the sort of transferability of some of those approaches, say in the health and wellness kind of optimization spaces. You've got this explosion of health and fitness apps, meditation apps, yoga apps, essentially encouraging people to change their behaviour, and whether we can apply some of the lessons there, whether they're applicable to environmental behaviour, because as you pointed out, to some extent, this is about an altruistic motivation. It's not just about, it does feel good, to learn how to garden and lose a bit of weight because you're eating food with a lower caloric density. Like it's still altruistically motivated. So that's a big question that we'll sort of see
absolutely
answered over the next kind of year, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and look, I think there's something fascinating as well. If if you think about 10, 20 years ago, there was nowhere near the level of kind of introspection is the wrong word, but people tracking themselves, the advent of the phone and the Fitbit and all of the devices that let you know how you're going and whether you, if I think to paraphrase Calvin and Hobbes, if the numbers are going up, you're having more fun, I think is the Bill Watterson quote. And I think as well there's something interesting in this idea that all of these companies who are operating in various spaces, yourself in climate, and then some of the meditation apps and some of the kind of personal finance apps are all trying to get people to change. I wonder how much opportunity there is for those companies to not only share learnings, but even share audiences. If you wanted to change your finances, you'd probably be just as interested in what behaviours you need to change your footprint as well.
Yeah, and this is something that we'll start to learn now that we're up and running. We've got our app in the market. Is what kinds of people? What kinds of people really respond to this type of product versus there are certain kind of almost like psychographic profiles where some people will really love it and love the structure we provide. It may not work for some other personality types, and kind of we'll start to drill into that a little bit. And that'll be something that'll be interesting to kind of get a more granular picture on. Is like, okay, well, this does work, but it only works for this type of person. Okay, what can we do for the other, 3/4 of people that care about this, but they don't
look like that.
Yeah.
Don't like leaderboards.
Yeah, exactly. So that's something. But what I like is that we've got an approach where it's a test, learn, adapt approach. So
no, it's very empirical, which is awesome. I also think that it feels to me like what you're creating and what you're learning could live in multiple places. You could find it in your banking and finance app, or you could find it in your meditation app to say, what, you don't need to necessarily go and find this whole new thing and have another whole experience. If you're here for behaviour change, you're going to build up this wealth of knowledge of what changes behaviour for these particular outcomes. And then ultimately you're in a position to take that, very broadly. At the moment you have quite an Australian focus on Australian vendors, but I'm sure that the behaviour change is more global and could be utilised everywhere if you just take the vendor part out of it.
Yeah, certainly. And, that'll be really interesting. I mean, we have to generate a successful result. We launched the app. We've based it on a bunch of research. We're testing what's working. We've had a really positive response so far.
Right.
But what does that look? Is it scalable? These are all the questions as a relatively early stage environmental enterprise we need to answer.
Absolutely, and probably a good segue. How have you arrived to be working on this problem? You talked about a background in energy and energy consultancy. I think let's step back a little bit.
Yeah, so I studied arts law at ANU, at Australian National University, and I was really interested in sort of social justice stuff when I was young. Yeah. My dad's a journalist, worked for the ABC for years. My mum works in mental health care. So I kind of had a family where I thought that to be a good person, I had to be working on something that benefited the community. And for a long time for me, because I was quite an argumentative little kid, I thought that would be being a lawyer, and I was like, I'll stand up for justice. And and then kind of did end up doing law at uni, didn't love it, kind of was pretty unenamored with the legal profession and the opportunities, there are plenty of fantastic lawyers do a lot of really good work, but I didn't feel like it was something that I wanted to work in. But at the same time, I realized like climate change, biggest social justice issue of my lifetime, certainly, and because of its unfair impacts. Mm-hmm. So I kind of got obsessed with it on that basis.
And this was while you were at university? Or
like second year uni. And then I sort of structured my degree, so I was focusing on that wherever possible. Went over to...
Within the context of a law degree?
Yeah, and major in political science as well, did social science. So, but I did go and work in government. I worked for GetUp, did campaigning with them when I was really young, in 21, something like that. Yep. Went over to the US, did an internship in Congress where I sort of looked at the EPA's greenhouse gas regulations. I volunteered for the Environmental Defender's Office, did a sort of summer clerkship through them. So I was sort of obsessed with it from, maybe 20 to 21, 22 years old. And, it initially been like, we've got to do political advocacy. That's the way to get change to happen. Right. So I focused, did a lot of work on like constitutional law reform, public law, worked for GetUp, worked for Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet as well. Mm-hmm. Did a few years there, went through their grad program. Yeah. Yep. But still I was kind of doing that with the goal of, I'll become a better political campaigner, if I work in government for a few years.
Right.
Then went and worked for GetUp and did, ended up working as their market impact director after a while, running those consumer campaigns, and have since done kind of consulting for a bunch of different groups, kind of green companies, sort of helping with strategic comms. And that was sort of my career to date, aside from One Small Step.
Yeah. Well, was there a moment where when you were in government, where you're thinking, this isn't where I'm best placed in terms of the ability to have the impact that you were trying to have?
I knew I didn't have the temperament to be a bureaucrat.
Is that the argumentative bit? Or?
Yeah, I think also
It should be good for politics.
Like, again, a lot of friends who are public servants, they're amazing people.
Love them to death. However,
they're really good. It's not for me. I think what was the reason there? Well, I didn't go in thinking I was going to be a public servant. I went in because I wanted to work from the outside in and be an effective activist.
Sure.
And I was interested in climate change and had supported, worked in corporate campaigning, get up on, getting the carbon tax through, did a lot of fact checking of a lot of the sort of pseudo economic papers coming out about what the impact of the carbon tax would be. So I didn't have much confidence that that working within government was the right approach. Certainly not on climate change when you look at the factors affecting policy in that area in Australia. Very close relationships between major parties and companies with an interest in slowing down reform, essentially.
Yeah. And so it's part of the one small step thing is actually thinking, you know what, we can circumvent that by going directly to the people who ultimately control where these companies, make their money or are able to raise their capital.
Yeah, it's not circumvent. I mean, I think the work that political organisations continue to do in Australia on climate change is essential, and it needs to keep happening.
Right.
But I felt that where I was going to be most useful was where I saw this gap, and it was in relation to systems to support wide-scale behaviour change. And I didn't think that, and I didn't think that government was, whether at local or state or federal level, I didn't think that government was an appropriate actor. Short of obviously the major policy changes you can have, creating incentives, a carbon tax, that creates an incentive for people to use less energy because your energy is more expensive. That's, pretty standard. But at the kind of micro level, I felt like the environmental movement, there was a missed opportunity with really working quite empirically on behaviour change.
Right.
When I did those campaigns at Get Up, getting people to switch to a carbon neutral electricity retailer and buy, green power, which is a renewables offsetting scheme. We did the numbers on those campaigns. They were very significant over a short amount of time. 15,000 people switched in 5 minutes to this retailer online. It was the same impact as having sort of 50,000 cars off the road when we looked at their energy usage.
Right.
With the Green Car campaign, we did it in 4 months. 4,000 people switched over. In terms of the renewable capacity added to the grid, it was double the impact of a community solar farm I'd worked on that's taken 6 years or more to get off the ground. So I went, okay, we can have a really big impact quite quickly, and that is a misconception that we can't do things as individuals. Sure, if your unit of analysis is one person, on my own, I'm not going to have a big impact, but it really doesn't take many people to have an impact directly on carbon emissions, but also on the rapidly growing the market share of businesses who are invested in a climate friendly, decarbonised economy. We helped grow. PowerShop was the company we partnered with for that campaign. They started out in a couple of suburbs in Melbourne, and 12 months later they were in all of Victoria, all of New South Wales, and moving into southeast Queensland. So,
just one part of this that I still haven't quite got to, because we started right up front, which was the behavioural science being at the core of how this works and how it's being rolled out. That's still a gap for me. If you're doing a law degree and a political science degree, at what point did you think I've got to go and learn that?
So it was while I was working in government. Right. I worked in this in-house management consulting unit. So it had been set up under RUD. It was at that time called Strategy and Delivery Division. Very important sounding.
Sounds very important. Was it on your card or?
I don't know if I even had a card. But I met David Halpern, the guy that had set up the behavioural insights team, through that. And they, that part of now, PMC now has the beta team, which is their sort of behavioural economics research unit. But prior to that, my division was kind of in touch with Halpern, and I got obsessed with behavioural economics and started reading about it. I spent probably did a microeconomics course. I'd already come across it in my political science degree, with choice theory in political science. That's Cass Sunstein. So he's one of the people who wrote the book called Nudge with Richard Thaler.
Okay.
So I sort of come across it academically and then got obsessed with it and sort of read everything I could on it.
Oh, it's fascinating. We'll probably get your review of the one or two things people should go and read, and we'll put that in the links as well, because it's always a bit of
Dan Ariel is a favourite of mine, obviously. He's such a lovely man. I mean, I don't know him, but through his writing.
Everything I've read about him
Seems
sounds
great.
wonderful. Sort of more broadly than like climate change is a massive topic, and I think you phrased it as the biggest social justice issue of our time.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I hadn't actually sort of thought about it in those terms, and I wouldn't debate it at all. I just hadn't sort of really considered that, and we could probably spend a whole podcast on that. You obviously have a broader concern about the environment, but like, what are the other sort of facets of this that you may not be working on specifically with One Small Step or otherwise that are still adjacent that you're interested in that sort of either motivate you or inspire you generally in change?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm really interested in behavioral psychology. Like I've always been interested in it. And I'm also interested in, separate to my work, like I guess productivity and performance more from like a coaching standpoint, So there are aspects of that probably feed into this for me.
Yep.
Yeah.
Perfect. And is there a particular, like other than Dan Ariely, is there some one or two people who you sort of think, this person, the stuff they write or, the stuff that they're creating or building, I find fascinating or personally interesting?
Yeah. I mean, another kind of area of interest for me is like, well, how do I run an effective business? That's not something I had experience in. Like,
we're all still learning, I assure you.
Yeah. And, so I just really like learning. I read a lot of nonfiction. One of the books I read on, really kind of business decision-making in businesses was Ray Dalio's Principles, which is like this tome. It's huge. And, but that's really, the things that he sort of outlines in that book, I use.
Especially the believability part, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Who do you listen to when you're operating?
And how much their opinion can count based on their ability to, I can't fully paraphrase it. Just on that book, actually, did you find that the bit that I found kind of, I thought about bringing it back into some of the workplaces I'm in, there's this idea that when you're in a meeting, you sort of give everyone a dot and rate them for their performance in that meeting, and it's kind of confronting. Did you?
I know. It was very entertaining in parts because I feel like, that's worked for Ray. Like there's this idea in psychology around what's called the wise mind, where you need to have a certain level of emotional intelligence to make really good decisions. You want to be taking kind of data points and what you're observing in the real world, but you also need to be able to like hear the kind of emotional signals and what are they telling you, and really combining your kind of emotions with whatever. We can't really say humans are rational, but like with our understanding of objective factors is how we make the best decisions. And I think, as is the case for many people, there's this kind of assumption that humans are capable of being rational. And I think Ray certainly kind of falls into that camp where emotions be damned. And I think that's not actually, I don't follow that approach exactly. And certainly when you think about radical candor or radical transparency, which is another thing he advocates, I think, again, you need to exercise some intelligence in how you communicate with people based on what's going to be best for them and based on their emotional needs,
and where they're at.
Yeah. And what's,
what's going on in their life at that point.
What's going to be constructive, so.
Yeah, there's some absolutely fascinating there. And then probably last question for me, how there's a lot to be done. You're super busy with the One Small Step. Like, what's your go-to? Like, what's your, place where you can go and be away from all that and find yourself or reconnect?
Yeah, honestly, it's hanging out with my friends, which has been hard during the pandemic.
Zoom call not doing it for you?
No, it's not the same. Yeah.
In what context? Like, let's unpack that a bit.
Oh, I like kind of lively dinner party conversations, people being really silly, quite playful. That's sort of my outside of work mode. And, it's hard to do that. It's hard to have that kind of fun energy if you can do it on Zoom, but it's not as easy.
No, you can't. I mean, you can, but it's not quite the same. That sounds fascinating. I wasn't expecting that response. Oh, that's amazing.
I read a book and knit. No, yeah. I mean, it's like knitting's fine.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, there's a lot of talk of people going back into nature, and I think in different ways. But I don't know. I think people overlook the healthiness and the escape that comes with social connection. So it was really interesting.
Yeah, I've worked out that I'm quite extroverted. I didn't know that about myself,
really?
But I know it now. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
When did you work that out?
I guess about 2 years ago.
Yeah, that's surprising. I mean, you're active. You're activist and out on the front line. I would have thought that would have come with the territory.
Yeah, I guess also self-awareness. That's something I've developed a bit better. So
Absolutely. Lily, it was amazing talking to you. I'm stoked to hear it all. I feel like we could have gone into a lot more detail on some of it, so we'll get some more links into the description so that people can follow that through. But thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was lovely.
Absolutely.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Shape the System. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a guest, someone that you know who's helped change a system for the better, please go to www.shapethesystem.org, click on the top right-hand corner, then click Suggest Guest. Make sure that you click subscribe so that you get the new episode. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures. Connects founders to the services they need along their journey. Whether you are looking to refine your strategy, mature your finance function, prepare for a capital raise, expand abroad, or simply comply with regulatory requirements, they provide you with the support you need to drive your business forward.